They say evolution is written in our bones, but sometimes it's written in the things we've lost. There was a time when our ancestors were not so different from the apes that roam the forest today, their bodies wrapped in thick fur, their skin hidden from the sun. But somewhere in the deep timeline of prehistory, something changed. The forests gave way to open plains. The air grew hotter. And for reasons still whispered in the language of our genes, our ancestors began to shed their fur. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't weakness. It was survival, but of a strange kind. The loss of hair would force them to master fire, to hunt differently, to think differently. Naked under the burning sky, they became something new, a species defined not by instinct, but by invention. That moment, when fur gave way to fire, marked the birth of humanity as we know it. Why did we lose our fur? What did evolution trade away, and what did it give us in return? This is the story of how losing what protected us made us unstoppable. Beneath the relentless African sun, millions of years ago, a transformation began that would change the fate of an entire species. It was not a leap, but a slow, intricate unraveling. One strand of hair, one flicker of gene, one adaptation at a time. Our ancestors, once cloaked in fur like their ape cousins, began to shed their hair. What started as a small genetic shift evolved into one of the most defining traits of humankind. Among the great apes, we alone stand naked, our bare skin glistening under sunlight, marked with sweat, vulnerability, and power. The loss of fur seems like an evolutionary paradox. How could losing protection against the cold, sun, and predators possibly help us survive? Yet hidden in this mystery lies the story of what it truly means to be human. The journey to hairlessness intertwines with the rise of intelligence, the mastery of fire, the crafting of tools, and the birth of culture. 2 million years ago, when Homo erectus roamed the open savannas of Africa, the environment was changing. Dense forests gave way to dry grasslands, and the air shimmered with heat. The once useful coat of hair that kept our ancestors warm in shaded forests now became a deadly liability under the burning sun. The brain, that greedy organ consuming nearly a quarter of the body's energy, generated immense heat. Without an efficient cooling system, it could literally overheat. Nature, as always, responded with ruthless precision. Hair was sacrificed, and in its place came a new system of thermoregulation: sweat. Across our bodies, millions of eccrine sweat glands evolved, capable of producing watery sweat that evaporated quickly, pulling heat away from the skin. This innovation turned our species into endurance athletes. While predators relied on speed and bursts of power, early humans learned to run their prey to exhaustion. This new physiology also allowed the brain to grow larger, as efficient cooling protected delicate neural tissue during intense exertion. Our ancestors could now travel farther, hunt longer, and think more clearly, a powerful evolutionary cocktail. But this physical transformation was more than skin deep. Beneath the surface, the blueprint of our biology was being rewritten. One crucial gene, KRT41P, responsible for forming strong hair shafts, became inactive in our lineage. In chimpanzees and gorillas, this gene builds coarse, thick hair. In humans, a single tiny mutation, a missing nucleotide, turned it off forever. That mutation occurred somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million years ago. From that moment, there was no turning back. Evolution had burned the bridge to our furry past. Once a gene becomes a pseudogene, a relic of what it once did, nature rarely revives it. We were now locked into a future of bare skin. Other genes joined this quiet revolution. The HR gene, a master controller of hair growth cycles, underwent changes that made our follicles smaller and less active. LCHEX2, another regulator that maintains follicle stem cells, lost enhancer regions that reduced its efficiency. Together, these mutations thinned our hair and made its growth uneven across the body. Hair didn't vanish entirely. It retreated to key regions: the scalp for sun protection, the armpits and groin for pheromone signaling, and the eyelashes and eyebrows for defense against dust and sweat. Evolution, as always, balanced loss with purpose. But the question remains, why did this change happen when it did? The answer lies in the firelit camps and open plains of Homo erectus. Around 1 million years ago, as our ancestors began mastering fire, the evolutionary pieces started locking into place. With fire came warmth, light, protection, and cooked food, a revolution that transformed survival itself. At the site of Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found ash and burned bones buried deep within the cave, proof that early humans were controlling fire nearly 1 million years ago. This mastery allowed them to sleep safely, cook food, and survive cool nights even without fur. Meanwhile, the ability to make and use tools reached new heights. In China, at the Zhoukoudian site known as the home of Peking Man, stone tools bear microscopic wear marks showing they were used for scraping hides, shaping wood, and even drilling holes. Some tools were used to process animal skins, evidence that these early humans may have wrapped themselves in hides for warmth. It is poetic. They lost their natural fur only to invent artificial fur. The same intelligence that allowed them to make fire also allowed them to create clothing. In this way, evolution began outsourcing biology to culture. Fire replaced warmth from fur, hides replaced hair, and soon cooperation replaced brute strength. But the loss of fur wasn't only about survival. It was about communication, beauty, and identity. Bare skin allowed us to display emotion, blushing, sweating, flushing with anger or attraction, signs that others could read. It made social interaction more transparent and trust more visible. Sexual selection likely played its part too. Smooth, hairless skin became a marker of health and vitality. In this way, biology and psychology intertwined. As we lost our fur, we gained social depth. The naked skin that once exposed us to danger now became a canvas for meaning, painted with pigments, scarified with ritual, and eventually clothed with invention. By 1 million years ago, the transformation was nearly complete. Our lineage had crossed a threshold that no other primate would. We had become a species that relied not only on what nature gave us, but on what we could create ourselves. The genetic switches that silenced our fur were irreversible, but they unlocked an entirely new form of evolution, cultural evolution. As the fires of early humans burned through the night, the reflection of that light danced across bare skin, signaling something extraordinary had begun. Hairlessness was no longer just a quirk of genetics. It was the foundation for intelligence, social connection, and adaptability. From that moment on, humans were no longer defined by what they had lost, but by what they had learned to replace. Our ancestors had traded fur for fire, instinct for innovation, and biology for culture. The story of hairlessness is the story of humanity itself, of evolution finding freedom not through addition, but through subtraction. In losing our fur, we didn't become weaker. We became human. By the time the genetic clock crossed the 1 million year mark, humanity's transformation into a hairless species was no longer just a mutation of skin and follicles, but a turning point in the very way our ancestors interacted with their environment. When genes like KRT41P and HR fell silent, they didn't just erase, they forced the rise of invention. The early humans of this era, particularly Homo erectus, were no longer protected by nature's blanket, and so they learned to wield something far more powerful: fire. Archaeological sites like Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa tell the silent story of that revolution, where layers of ash and burned bones show that 1 million years ago, humans had begun to master controlled fire, using it deep within caves where no natural blaze could reach. This mastery marked a profound shift in survival itself. It meant warmth could be summoned at will, predators could be held at bay, and food could be softened and shared. The naked skin that once signaled fragility was now the skin of a creature learning to bend the elements to its will. The human body had lost its fur, but gained the mind and hands to make its own warmth. Around 780,000 years ago, in the ancient campfires of Gesher Banat Yaakov in Israel, charred plants and flint fragments were found arranged in patterns that could only have come from repeated, intentional fire use. This was not mere survival, it was culture, the birth of habit and knowledge passed through generations. In this world of flickering flames and cold winds, the next great adaptation appeared: animal hides. Archaeological findings show that early humans began to scrape, soften, and wear the skins of other animals for protection. At the Zhoukoudian site near Beijing, where the famous Peking man lived between 500,000 and 750,000 years ago, microscopic analysis of stone tools reveals wear marks from scraping hides, sharpening wooden spears, and crafting compound tools bound with sinew and resin. These ancient hands, once used to climb trees, were now crafting weapons and clothing, repurposing nature's defenses for their own. Peking man's people were no longer merely surviving, they were engineering their world. They shaped wood, hafted stone tips to spears, and used fire not just to cook or warm, but to harden their tools and process skins. Their firelight illuminated the first workshops of humanity. The scraping of hides whispered the beginnings of clothing. The drilling of holes into stone and bone hinted at curiosity, ritual, or the earliest steps toward symbolism. The evolutionary loss of fur had set off a domino effect. Every adaptation that followed was a cultural response to a biological loss. As Homo erectus spread into the colder, more unpredictable climates of Eurasia, they carried these behaviors with them. Sites like Schöningen in Germany, dating back around 300,000 years, tell of hunters armed with wooden spears, skinning bears and horses with precision, leaving behind telltale marks that reveal not hunger, but craftsmanship. At Bilzingselben, delicate cut marks on beaver bones suggest the removal of pelts rather than the harvesting of meat. Humans were choosing animals for their hides, understanding texture, insulation, and use. The fur they lost had returned in another form, shaped by intelligence and intention. This is the paradox at the heart of human evolution. What we lose, we recreate through thought. Fire took the place of warmth. Clothing replaced fur. Tools extended the power of hands. Nakedness became not weakness, but a blank slate for innovation. Yet, as practical as these changes were, they also carried unseen psychological effects. The skin, now exposed, became a medium of communication, of touch, of social connection. Sweat became a tool of thermoregulation and emotion. Blushing and scent became subtle signals of attraction and social bonding. The hairless body allowed for new levels of tactile sensitivity, mothers feeling their infant's skin against their own, partners recognizing one another through warmth and scent rather than fur. In losing hair, humanity gained intimacy. And as firelight revealed bare faces and bodies, perhaps the first sparks of aesthetic awareness were born, the roots of attraction, ornamentation, and identity. Evolution was no longer only about genes, it was about meaning. Each step away from nature's protection brought humans deeper into self-made worlds. The loss of fur demanded tools, tools demanded cooperation, cooperation demanded communication, and communication demanded mind. The chain reaction of hairlessness stretched far beyond the surface of the skin. It transformed the brain, the hand, and the heart. By mastering fire, crafting hides, and adapting behaviorally instead of biologically, our ancestors turned vulnerability into strength. They became the first species to truly rewrite its own evolutionary script. Where other mammals adapted through fur, claws, or teeth, humans adapted through imagination. Nakedness was no longer a symbol of exposure, it was the mark of a creature that had outgrown the limitations of its body and entered the realm of thought. By the time the evolutionary story reached its later chapters, the transformation that had begun with the loss of fur had already reshaped everything about what it meant to be human. Yet the world was not inhabited by one species alone. Across the continents, multiple kinds of humans existed side by side: Homo erectus, Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis, and others, each carrying its own balance of old and new traits. Some still wore coats of hair, clinging to the biological past, while others, like the direct ancestors of Homo sapiens, walked nearly bare under the open sun. This divergence was not random, it reflected different solutions to the same eternal question of survival. Those who remained in tropical forests or humid lowlands retained their fur as protection against insects and thorns, while those who ventured into open savannas and highlands traded it for the freedom of sweat and skin. But losing fur was not simply about shedding hair, it was a shift in identity, in behavior, in the very logic of evolution. As hair vanished, culture filled the void. Nakedness was met with invention, fire, clothing, shelter, cooperation. Evolution stopped acting only on bodies and began acting on minds. Those who learned faster, who shared warmth, who crafted hides and tools, were the ones who survived. And so, the brain grew, not just in size, but in capacity for memory, imagination, and planning. The skin that once held fur now held meaning. It carried pigment to shield against the sun. It became a surface for sensation, for communication, for touch and empathy. The loss of fur made humans more aware of themselves and of others, revealing emotions in blushing faces, fear and goosebumps, desire and warmth. This was the beginning of social transparency. In the absence of fur, the human face became a mirror of the mind. But to live without fur was also to live with danger. The cold nights of Eurasia and the damp winds of Europe demanded new responses. Sites like Schöningen in Germany and Bilzingshausen reveal the story of these struggles: hunters scraping hides, cutting beaver pelts, crafting spears, and building fires that glowed like suns against the ice. Instead of waiting for evolution to regrow fur, they built their own. Fire was their shield, and clothing became their second skin. What other species evolved biologically? Humans invented technologically. It was the moment when nature's control began to weaken, when intelligence began to overrule instinct. Fire not only gave warmth but reshaped the rhythm of human life. It extended daylight into the night, allowing speech, cooperation, and imagination to flourish in the dark. The fireside was the first school, the first home, the first temple. Here, knowledge passed between generations, stories began, and communities formed. The loss of fur had driven them to gather together, to build culture, to define belonging. It was no longer just about survival. It was about identity. Around the fire, humans became human. As time marched forward, these naked, fire-bearing beings expanded across continents. Some crossed into colder regions and adapted with furs, dwellings, and shared heat. Others followed the sun and relied on their skin's melanin to protect them. But no matter where they went, the evolutionary feedback loop between biology and culture deepened. The naked skin, once a vulnerability, became the very symbol of adaptation. When the last great ice age came, humans did not die shivering. They built fires, sewed hides, constructed shelters, and painted the walls of caves, marking not only survival but consciousness. Nakedness became a mark of defiance, of mastery over nature. It was no longer a weakness, it was a declaration. What fur once did automatically, the human mind could now achieve deliberately. The loss of hair had set off a cascade that would never reverse. From this point on, our species was no longer bound entirely by biology, but by creativity. Fire replaced warmth. Tools replaced claws. Clothing replaced fur. And cooperation replaced instinct. This transformation was so powerful that even as humans spread across icy tundras and alpine peaks, no branch of our lineage ever re-evolved a coat of fur. The genetic die was cast, and the path of intelligence had no return. When we look at the fossil record, this pattern becomes clear. Species like Homo naledi, deep in the caves of South Africa, still retained small brains and likely hairy bodies. They did not need to lose their fur because they lived in constant darkness and warmth. On the islands of Indonesia, the small Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit, likely stayed hairy as well, dwelling in rainforests where humidity and insects made bare skin a disadvantage. But in the open, unpredictable plains of Africa and Eurasia, a different story was unfolding. The larger-brained Homo erectus had already crossed the biological threshold, hair gone, sweat flowing, fire crackling, tools glinting. This was the lineage that would one day give rise to Homo sapiens, a species defined not by what nature gave it, but by what it learned to make. Every human alive today carries the imprint of that moment in our DNA, the silence of KRT41P. The reprogrammed sweat glands, the endless sensitivity of bare skin that can feel heat, pain, touch, and connection. Even now, we sweat more efficiently than any animal on Earth. We cool faster, we endure longer, we live by the skin. Hairlessness is not a flaw, it is the price of brilliance. It is the foundation of everything that came after: art, language, clothing, civilization. When early humans stared into the flames a million years ago, warming their bare hands, they were not just surviving, they were beginning to understand themselves as something separate from the wild, as beings who could shape their fate. That awareness born from the loss of fur was the dawn of humanity. Our nakedness is the mark of our divergence from instinct, the proof that evolution took a leap into mind. Where once we were covered and protected, we became exposed, thinking, creative. That exposure forced empathy, cooperation, and storytelling. When the wind bit at their skin, they learned to wrap hides. When the night grew cold, they fed fire. When rain fell, they built shelter. And when danger came, they stood together, not as individuals covered in fur, but as a collective species protected by intelligence. Hairlessness was not the end of evolution, it was the moment when evolution passed the torch to imagination. It forced us to become the inventors of our own survival. It was the moment we stopped being shaped by nature and began shaping nature itself. From that moment on, the human story was no longer just a biological tale, it was a cultural one, written in smoke, sweat, and skin. The creatures who once hid beneath fur became the beings who could stand bare beneath the stars, their firelight flickering against the darkness, their minds burning brighter than any flame. Naked, thinking, and unafraid, they became the architects of a new kind of evolution, the evolution of the mind.